Welcome everyone in person and online. This is our last talk of the semester. So today we actually have a talk by a few people. So we have Jessy Li, who is the lead of the CosmicAI Explorable group on the AI side, and she's been directing our Astro co-pilot model, soon to be renamed maybe something else. And also speaking is Sebastian Joseph, who is one of our first year grad students, and he is going to tell us about his work on the Astro Bench code benchmark. All right, take it away, Jessy.
Great. So thank you for introducing. So this talk will be two parts. I will be presenting the first. So what I'm going to talk to you about is at a very high level, what are the basic training regimes for large language models as a bird eye kind of view? And I'll specifically put it in the context of kind of astronomy and the kind of co-pilot soon to be renamed assistant that we're aiming for. So, so I'm from the Explorable Universe group. Why doesn't it move now? Here we go. So here is our team. We have Matt Lees, a co-director, and me. We have Stephanie, and here's Adam. Need to put his name, and then Greg, Baharan, and Hai. So just a little bit of introduction of what we are doing within our working group. So we are mostly focused on two parts. One is we want to really push for the foundational AI component for the institute, such that we will be able to have a coding or research assistant with generative AI. And we'll focus on kind of both making it work for this domain and as well as efficiency. So both training efficiency as well as inference efficiency. There will be also a big focus led by Matt Lees on the human-computer interaction component to think about what does it actually mean for AI to be part of the research process. Stephanie and Adam will be mostly leading a astronomy data platform. So in today's talk, I will focus on the foundational AI part. That is the part I'm personally involved with. And I will talk a little bit about large language models. And then a very, very important question then is like, how do we actually evaluate these systems and their capabilities? And that's what Sebastian will be talking about. So the progress of large language models in the past few years has been astonishing. We went from just one model-ish in 2019 to basically different model kind of every month. And I don't know how to minimize this part. So I minimized it on my computer, but it's still here. So I don't know why.
Maybe you can work with that afterward.
Oh yeah, that's okay. Let me do this. That's better. Yes. Okay. So how do these things work? How do we actually train them? So I'll start from kind of very simple things. 60 years ago, we have Rosenblatt inventing the perceptron. Do people in this room know what it is? Not really. Okay. So basically, you have a bunch of inputs. These are represented by axes. And you have an output that is the y hat. Okay, so the y hat is what you're predicting given the input. And you have these bunch of weights and the function, nonlinear function now. So the idea is you will be able to kind of find the best weights such that, oops, sorry. Okay, find the best weights such that you can make the best prediction given the training data. What's interesting about this framework is you can actually stack them together to make something much more complicated. And in the most modern large language models that you see today, these components in the middle are called transformer layers. So these are invented by, mostly led by Google in 2017. So in this paradigm, we have on the input side different words, or you can think about them as just different tokens if you're talking about code. And each of these intermediate steps transform the input into some sort of a kind of a representation. And this representation, you can mostly think about them as vectors, like numerical real value vectors. So you have like very discrete input on the x side, and then you kind of keep transforming these inputs, and you get those representations that the model can reason about. Now, very fundamental question for language modeling is like, what is this y hat that you're predicting? And that is kind of the next word prediction task. So if you think about look up at the, you know, sky. Okay. No one says stars. Okay.
So,
Well, one thing is you can keep doing this, right? You can do this for every single word in the sentence. And what is the prediction in the end? If you think about look up at the sky, it is the most probable. So this is probability Sebastian extracted from GPT 3.5 this morning. And you can see stars in the skies. But then all these also have weights. They're just much less probable. So this is like a distribution over all of the vocabulary words in your vocabulary that every step that you're predicting. Okay, when you do this repeatedly with you know, all the things you have generated or in a context. Okay, so to recap, we have a task which is predict the next word, look up at the what. Right, and you turn these words into vectors through the transformer model. And I'm using these kind of little dots to represent the actual vector for each words. And there are many layers of such transformers. So you do that again and again and again. At the end of the day, the representation of the last word will kind of encode what's coming. Okay. So you have an input, you take it through the transformer, you get a probability distribution for the next word. And most of the time, these models are really, really big. I mentioned these weights at the very beginning, and the numbers of parameters means how many weights there are. And we're talking about billions and billions of weights that the model needs to learn, which requires a lot of hardware. And these parameters going to define and calculate the kind of probability distribution that you see. You may ask, okay, no, so why this task, right? One important thing to consider is like this task gives us amount of data that's like basically the entire internet. So we have unlimited, kind of limited, but kind of like still really a lot of data that we could learn from. And you can do this repeatedly for every sentence, like I said. But also, once you have enough data, once you have seen so much, you can actually do a lot of different things than just predict the next word. For example, you can predict the answer to this question about when was CERN founded, right? Okay. So the training data looks like this. So this is a screenshot from the DOMA paper. So that was being used to train the AI2 OMO models. And you can see how many billions of tokens there are and the type of data there is. So there's text, semantic scholar, there's Wikipedia, and there's code. I'm not monitoring the chat. Okay, great. But actually, if you just do the next word prediction task, it's not going to be enough. Okay, so here is a prompt I gave to the Mixtral 70 billion model. It's a really powerful model now about this query. And as you can see, this is the continuation from the base model. It's really not that great. It kind of gets something at the beginning, but then it starts repeating itself, right? So you're really not getting like the kind of AI capability these days that you actually are getting used to. So the trick for getting the model to do actually what you want it to do is through post-training, mostly supervised fine-tuning data sets consisting of different answers and questions of different domains. So it can be math, it can be code, and whatnot. So this is going to be kind of one of the key ingredients that we are hoping to push for to make the Copilot work. So here is an example of how this kind of data looks like. So this is from Llama 3, and you can see these kind of QA examples has kind of a very different type of how it's kind of formed, and you can see these are much more domain specific and QA oriented. Okay, so do we have an assistant yet, you may ask? So here's the vision. We originally thought about how kind of Copilot could help us do, and we can just look at the first query, right? So this is the ideal situation if we can have something that can kind of generate a SQL code for us, and then we can generate some plots. So, and we have, on the other hand, Google's deep research and OpenAI models and the reasoning models. It seems that we could get there, but have we? And the answer is no. So I tried this on Google's latest model, and it kind of does something. It's thinking about plannings, and it's kind of trying to execute something, but then all of a sudden it switched to French, and it actually never finished. Okay, so really we are really not there, even though all these really big models are getting more and more capable. So this is kind of one of the key motivations for us to actually build something that's that can work. One key challenge that we have faced is what kind of data do we train on? Like I said before, when you so it is this slide, right? If you want the model to be actually able to do anything, then you need this kind of very well-formed question answer data. You would need to know, okay, what is the intention of my kind of writing this chunk of code? And then I can turn that into a question and answer pair. And then after that, I can turn that into something that the model can ingest and be trained on. But that's not quite how the data looks like in the wild. So in the wild, what we have are basically GitHub repos, right? So the data looks something like this. It's very, I don't know if people can see, but it's very, very API-like. It's not well documented. It has a nice doc string, but you also see kind of, it can do some work, but it's not how you procedurally do research as an astronomer. On the other hand, this type of code is much rarer, but this is kind of what we want. It does something, it kind of makes a histogram and then plots a map and then interpolates the map. So this is actually like a step-by-step as something you would be able to do. But this type of code is small. So one of the key challenges we're trying to actually tackle is how do we get more and more of this type of code, and that's kind of the current effort focus is about. So we don't have a lot of results to show you, but I can say our approach, basically we do synthetic data generation. So going back to the type of code that's here, but then try to turn it into the code that we can actually use, thinking about like test cases and things, to be a little bit more aligned with this. We're also doing data curation, and data curation that's led by Bahara's group at UCLA, to get kind of basically filter down our data into more of like this kind of data, such that we have a little bit cleaner training data for our own Copilot. So with that, I will hand over to Sebastian, and he will talk to you about how do we evaluate.
Do you want to take questions?
Oh yeah, I
I'm
can.
getting online, but
Yeah. If there are any questions for now, I can take them.
I have a very quick question.
Mm-hmm.
So, are you planning to roll out your model soon enough so you're gonna get like some feedback from people, like from astronomers? They're gonna just like use it, and then it basically like how ChatGPT is getting feedback from people.
Yes. So we plan to so we are training the base SFT model, like the fine-tuned model, and then once we do have something that's working that can score reasonably well on the benchmark he's going to present, then we will hopefully push it out and have people try and actually try to get feedback. One thing that's kind of in the works, in part of the future plan, is kind of this kind of human alignment post-training. Kind of models usually have kind of different types of outputs, and sometimes you see when you call ChatGPT, you can say which one is better. So that's kind of one of the type of feedback that we want to also collect. And I will share this screen for Sebastian's part.
Hi, I'm Sebastian. I'm Jessy's student working on this benchmark for astronomy. And so what we're trying to do here is that if we want to release a good model for astronomers to use in their research, you first need to know what what that kind of model entails, what that model should be good at. And so that's kind of the effort we're going at here. We're trying to evaluate models and see if they are good at helping astronomers doing those sorts of astronomy tasks. And so that's what we're developing a benchmark that evaluates an LLM on their ability to generate code for a variety of astronomy related tasks. And we try to basically answer these sorts of research questions. How adept are LLMs in using the kind of niche libraries and APIs that astronomers use that are not like widely used in other areas in other fields. And we want to know how LLMs can reason through an astronomy task. So if you tell them to do some sort of task, can it reason about the different steps involved and then complete that task correctly? And we want to know how well they can respond to the queries that are not filled with jargon or that are not that are responding to a typical use query. So that means like something that astronomers would prompt with an LLM, knowing that the LLM has the knowledge to understand all that jargon, all that knowledge. And finally, we want to know how well LLMs are good at visualizing and presenting the findings they get from completing those astronomy related tasks. And so there's been a bunch of prior work that looks at benchmarking for code. And so one of the earliest benchmarks is HumanEval. It was developed by OpenAI, and it looked at it had a bunch of Python problems that specifically looked at how well the models knew how to write Python, how well they knew how to do simple mathematics and some algorithms, but they don't cover the kind of complex scientific tests that we're working. And so we're getting kind of closer here. We reached this benchmark, which is DS1000, which covers like 1,000 data science problems, covering several Python libraries like Pandas and NumPy. But this, once again, covers just general data science problems. And then finally have the big, so the recently, just this year released a benchmark called Big Cone Bench, and it covers many complex tasks in a variety of different domains. So like networking, cryptography, but the problem here is that it doesn't cover a lot of that niche astronomy related APIs and domains that we're kind of looking for. And generally, all these code benchmarks, they test programming capabilities. So how well the model, if you tell it to do a certain task in natural language, how well it can then go about and write that code correctly. But it does not test the domain knowledge you need to complete these sorts of scientific tasks using code. So that's not being tested in any of these benchmarks. And so one benchmark that does try to do this is this benchmark called SciCode. And it's a scientific coding benchmark where you kind of give all these interesting problems like generating an array of numbers. So it covers various fields, chemistry, biology, and physics. And what they test here is basically how well the model knows these sorts of domain knowledge and how they can represent them in computationally with code. But though what they test here is scientific computation. So they only use libraries like NumPy and they only use libraries like NumPy to kind of compute develop these problems, and they're not able to kind of test. They're not testing the kind of niche in domain APIs that are being used generally for a lot of astronomy research. And so another aspect that we want to really evaluate is how well can models visualize results from that they kind of compute. And there are a lot of visualization. So this visualization benchmarking is relatively new. So this is one of the latest benchmark papers for visualization. It's called VisiVal, and it basically benchmarks a lot of very simple bar charts and line graphs and those sorts of kind of visualizations. And we see that in astronomy, these visualizations are not really sufficient. There are very more complex kind of visualizations involved that require domain knowledge. So it's not really that applicable here. And there has been work that looks at these very in-domain astronomy charts. But the problem here is that they're not really benchmarking visualizations. In this paper in domain CQA, they're instead looking at whether the models can understand the charts. So what we want to know is how well the models themselves can generate these visualizations. And so covering all these different aspects, we were looking at we developed the Astro code bench. So we want to evaluate whether an LLM can properly complete scientific tasks, astronomy-related tasks using code, and then present them visually. And so what we've seen is that we've taken Jupyter notebooks which contain code and visualizations, or code visualizations associated with that code. We take those visualizations, we create natural language queries for those visualizations that are kind of describe those visualizations and what you need to kind of make them. And then we give them to an LLM, and the LLM generates code using those natural language queries, and we execute that code, and then we evaluate the outputs from those executions using a variety of methods. So that's the general gist of the Astro code bench. And so let's first talk about the data collection. For data collection, we collect a bunch of Jupyter notebooks from a variety of publicly available repos. So one of the sources we are using is the curated notebook repo from Master Data Lab, as well as another bunch of curated repos from the STS-CL team. And so we're the code within all of these notebooks represent like a variety of different tasks, and they use various astronomy-related libraries that we kind of listed here in the slide. And so the question is, why do we use Jupyter notebooks? So Jupyter notebooks themselves have a mixture of natural language and code, which practically is very useful when we are trying to create these natural language queries. But for more related to our research, related to what Jessy kind of discussed earlier, we see that the code in the wild, or the code that's available in the wild, is usually very API-like, so very related to code for use for creating libraries and tools. And these are the kind of code that's mostly publicly available. And what we see that a lot of Jupyter notebooks are representative of the code that uses these APIs, the kind of the client code that we want the models to generate and to evaluate. And so that's why we use Jupyter notebooks. And an added benefit is that these Jupyter notebooks usually produce a lot of visualizations. So we get a lot of data that pairing code and visualizations. So that's another very useful very useful aspect of Jupyter notebooks. And so why do we focus on visualizations then? And so the key thing is that in astronomy research, we find the good visualizations are often key contributions in astronomy research. So visualizations kind of represent a new way of, with the good visualizations, you can glean insights, and it represents a new and unique way of like looking at the sky. So they are often the endpoint of many tasks in astronomy. And with this, because of this endpoint, we can evaluate whether a task is being completed correctly by analyzing that visualization itself. And so we can split the code. So it would be to do this, we first look at what types of code in the notebook lead up to the visualizations, and then we try to split that code up into several steps. That so there we have setup code, which looks at ports and the environment setup for the generating the entire visualization. We have the processing code, which is all the code that's needed prior to generating that visualization that's needed for computation and analysis. And so this is kind of the meat of completing that astronomy task and doing all those computations necessary, and that all those reasoning steps involved. And then finally, you have that visualization code, which is involved in that code generating that target visualization. So this is an example visualization that we have in our benchmark. And once we split up all the code into these three stages, we can then create queries associated with them, and then prompt those queries to large language models and have them generate the compare. So that's kind of the way we're evaluating this. So how do we design these user queries? There is a lot of nuance involved in designing these natural language queries. So one of our research questions that we want to answer is how well do these models respond to typical use queries? So these queries, we don't want any simplification of jargon or terminology. We don't want, when astronomers are using our model, we don't want them to explain certain terms. We don't want them to explain what a color magnitude diagram is, right? That's just kind of being implicit. And then we would expect the astronomers to like leave out information that they assume is obvious. They are expecting the model to have astronomy knowledge, and within these typical use queries, there can be a range of acceptable responses because of these sorts of under specifications. But we can't really these kind of range is not really conducive to an evaluatable query. So we want a query that, if we give to a language model, produces a result that is closely that if the model knows how to generate that visualization, how to generate that code, can closely match the ground truth. And so the way we generate queries here is that we give a prompt to GPT-4. We give a code, the code associated with that query to GPT-4, and then we have the model generate a query associated with that code. So what you need to do to get that code for an LLM to reproduce that code. So basically, the typical use query kind of covers that first section where it's just like you need to create a plot of color with magnitude for galaxies. And then the part that makes them valuable is the sort of second part here, where you have to kind of specify what channels you're using to plotting and what kind of samples you need to plot this graph. And so this is kind of the ideal queries that we're trying to go for, and we've developed a prompt to allow GPT-4 to generate these sorts of queries for each sort of code segment that we have. And so once we have all of these queries, we can then feed them to the target LLM. And so this is the evaluation step. So the model that we eventually evaluate, we give the queries to that model, and that we expect the model to produce code as output as a result. And then an additional aspect of this that for the context, the model receives the ground truth prior to that visual section. So if you're generating code for the visualization section, the model receives ground truth for the processing section, and so on and so forth. And this is mainly to ensure that we're evaluating each of these sections independently, as opposed to having model that works very well at the processing section and works very well at the the visualization section, the visualization is not really being impacted by the model's ability to generate the processing section code. And then we do an additional constraint where we don't generate or test for the setup code. And this is mainly because we want to constrain the model generation to already installed libraries. And this allows us to execute this code more. This allows us to execute this code and not have an error out on not having these libraries installed in our environments. And there are two ways that we can evaluate the code produced by the language models. One way is to compare this code textually. So there are automatic methods that exist that do compare code textually. There is this method called CodeBlue, which looks at the textual and then the syntactic similarities between the code and then generates a score from that. And then there is another method called CodeBlue, a BERT score, which uses a BERT base model, a fine-tuned BERT model to analyze the code and then generate a similarity score. And what we see is that the problem with this sort of option, although it is very fast and you can get a score really quickly, is that the syntactic and textual similarity we get from comparing code is not really equivalent to the correctness of that code. So the code could be very similar to that code, but it may be using a slightly different function, maybe adding some more invalid arguments, and that could lead to that code being having syntax errors and not running correctly. And then the other case is that you could have code that is very different in terms of syntax and uses like a different methodology, but still arrives at that same result. So that's when we're looking at correctness, ultimately the best way to do that is with option number 2, which is executing that code and then comparing the outputs from that code. And so the first level evaluation that we do is first executing the code. Does that code execute? And if not, why not? And we find a lot of errors in this way, simply by executing code. So what we see that models often do, because they have a very surface level knowledge of a lot of these niche repos. They often hallucinate what sort of functions are associated with modules. So in this particular instance, the model hallucinates get file. It's not a real. This is not a real function call within the library, and so by doing this execution, by executing this code and getting this result, we are able to get kind of this initial knowledge of what the model is aware about the API, and I guess the main barriers for this, as opposed to say comparing the code textually, is that there are barriers involved in executing code. It is much more difficult. You have to install modules manually for a lot of these niche libraries, which make them difficult to scale. There are a lot of byproducts when you're trying to execute complex tasks and that involve processing large files and that take up storage. And then in terms of the code that we're working on, the biggest barrier we see is like the execution may take a long time. We're dealing with code that processes a lot of large files. You're dealing with code that does a lot of complex computations. And so in working with that code, running all that code and working with that code, that code might take a very long time to run. And this is a potential barrier for the benchmark, although it is not something that is completely like unstoppable, like total barrier, whatever. Yeah. So after executing that code, another thing that we look at mainly for the processing stage of the query, so mainly for analyzing those sorts of the kind of code that, well, for the code that focus on like reasoning about like astronomy tasks, is that we want to see what kind of whether that code is being is actually correct. And the main way we do that is that we've got this insight that the dependent variables in the visualization code. So in the visualization, when they're generating the visualizations, the data that's being used from the visualizations that's being generated or processed in the processing code, those dependent variables are the key variables in the processing code. And then we collect within the ground truth, we collect all these key variables. We store them, we pickle them, and then when we're evaluating the generated code, we do an equivalency test between all the assigned variables in the generated code and then the key variables in the ground truth code. And then if the key variables, essentially, if the generated code encompasses all those key variables within its assigned variables, then we'd say that test passes. That the processing code the model generates does cover all the necessary data or does all the necessary computations to then pass on to the visualization code side. So, and then the final aspect of this is actually evaluating the visualizations. So this comes back to that last question we had in that objective slide. This is how adept are LLMs in visualizing and presenting findings from the astronomy-related tasks. And to answer this kind of question, we needed to know what entails a good visualization. And we needed expert feedback for that. So first we do a human evaluation. So experts are currently, still in the process of doing this. We're evaluating 240 visualization pairs between the ground truth and generated visualizations. And then they do this kind of schema of determining what type of error this visualization has, whether it has no error, whether it has a major error, the visualization, whether it has a minor error. And then we get the rationale for why that judgment was being made. And the hope is that if we take out the expert and then put a vision LLM in there to compare these, to do this valuation task itself, it will come up with judgments that are correlated highly with the human judgments and come up with similar rationales as well. And so that is kind of the current status of our benchmarking project. We have around 485 three-stage queries from 113 notebooks. We have a pipelining, so we have the pipeline set up for generating and executing all of the generating and executing for various different language models on these benchmark queries. And then we have a few steps remaining, mainly completing that expert human evaluation for those visualization evaluations, and then developing that BLM as a judge method and making sure that's sufficiently correlated with expert judgment, and then finally benchmarking all the latest models completely and figuring out what these models are doing. And we do have some preliminary results on this. This is just to show that the models are not really good at doing this task. It's not really good at generating executable code that completes astronomy tasks. So this is just looking at the percent that was executed without error. And as you can see, a majority of these, like 4 out of 5 of these models, less than 50% are able to execute without error. And so then more than 50% of the code that these models generate from the benchmark contains some sort of error in them. The exception being Gemini 2.5, or the latest Gemini. And yeah, yes, we have some question answer.
Can I just ask a quick question, which is, you said it takes a long time to execute. What is a long time here?
A long time. So to execute all the so the entire 484 kind of queries, it takes around close to 5 hours, but this varies depending on what the model generates, right? So if the model generates a lot of bad code and errors out, will go a little faster. But generally, it takes around that time, around 5 hours.
There's a question in the chat. Yifan, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, so my question basically is from my experience, I use Claude a lot for my coding problem. It's been great for like actual specific tasks. So I was wondering if you're using a relatively weak model like Llama with post-training, how does it compare to like the state-of-the-art, like the GPT-03, like Claude, Gemini 2.5, how does it compare for like astronomy specific tasks?
So in this slide right here, we do test Claude Sonnet 3.7, so the latest Claude model, and like I guess in your experience, you kind of seen good astronomy code, and we do see that. But what we see the problem is like the model does make errors, so we do test pretty comprehensively on a variety of different tasks. So the model does make errors on the various hallucinating different kind of functions and different kind of and different kind of arguments. So that's another kind of error you're seeing. So that's kind of why the percent executed is kind of low here. But yeah, we do all these models are, I think GPT-4 is kind of outdated now. All these models are the latest iteration in their series.
I think a key challenge here is also the benchmarks that we're building, and especially the notebook kind of format is very challenging for the models because it's really a flow. It's a workflow that we are testing. It's not independent kind of code completion or like write me this kind of functionality that we're trying to complete. So I think it's more about the nature of what the object, the task that we're testing, and that's why these latest model, even the latest like Claude and Gemini, are not doing well.
And also it is a little bit, I think, different from person to person. I did not have good experience with Claude. Like GPT, I have like been like
Yeah.
So you found works on exoplanets. We work on galaxy cosmology.
Yeah.
And our notebooks are much more heavy on galaxy cosmology. So maybe there's like a
Oh,
mismatch.
interesting. Yeah.
A little bit facetious comment, but
Yeah.
there's definitely different paths across the different subfields.
Mm-hmm.
I think my experience personally is the prompt itself is very important. But I think I'm more curious about like if you start with a model that is fairly weak, like Llama, and post-train, can you match it with the stronger model just in general?
We think the key is the kind of the post-training data that I mentioned earlier about kind of how do you actually get the right data for supervised fine-tuning. I think if we get the targeted training data, we should be able to do at least kind of be able to call niche APIs like what Sebastian was saying.
Okay, thanks.
Other questions? Yeah, let's say.
What's your plan to grow your training data? Like, so say you mentioned this was from a curated set of notebooks. Like, what's the overall size of the data set that you have access to?
So yeah, we're working. So this is not really training data. This is more so evaluation data. So there's another effort going on collecting a lot of training data. So a lot of data that looks like this. We're trying to both collect this data from that's available publicly, that exists on GitHub and those sorts of code repos. And also there's an effort to synthetically generate this code as well. So that's what we're using for training data. But for evaluation data, we're using these kind of curated notebooks that we found to be pretty reliable and we can trust that the code is good and representative of astronomy research.
Have you considered soliciting, or like maybe you already are soliciting the community to try to get?
Yeah, we would love to have to get more. Yeah, we'd love to get more notebooks from the community. We would love to get more code from astronomers. Right now we're working with one of the sources that we use is the kind of collection of books we get from the Astro Data Lab people, and we are in talks with Stephanie from the Astro Data Lab who's working on these notebooks. So we're kind of get that effort going on. But we definitely appreciate people donating their notebooks or whatever they have that they've kept kind of private. So that's kind of the main challenge here is that a lot of the stuff that's available publicly that astronomers are willing to put up publicly are these kind of API or library code, because that's the kind of code they want other people to use, right? The code that they use for their own research, they'd rather keep to themselves and then just present the results in their papers. So that's the kind of code that people keep to themselves. That's the kind of code that we really need to both train our models and also be really useful for evaluation.
There's another online question. Alexander, do you want to ask your question?
Oh yeah, sure. So since y'all mentioned that some of these questions, the answers from them are more like workflows where it's not like an individual small snippet of code. What I've seen around for like writing, larger pieces of software, people tend to use like coding agents where it's a sequence of LLM calls where the prompt can change from one to the next and it can kind of iterate based on errors that it sees and so on. It can orchestrate, is that but it sounds like what you guys are testing on are individual calls, and maybe that's I feel like that might be part of why there's such a high error rate compared to when people use coding agent. I mean, and I know that like some of the astro specific calls maybe like so specific that a general coding agent might not know how to use it. But this is kind of I think I agree with Yifan a little bit that at least personally I've had not with Astro tools, but I've had great good amount of success using coding agents where you just in the system prompt describe what all the tools can do and exactly how to use them, and it can figure out pretty well how to write larger blocks of code.
Yeah. So in this benchmark, we want to evaluate this kind of. Okay. All right, we go to this slide. So we want to evaluate these kind of the typical use queries, right? So we could break it up into injecting flows and give that kind of like very specific step-by-step information. But this is not, if we want an astronomer to use our LLM, we would expect that like if we give this very simple use query, that the model would be enabled to generate the code necessary to complete that task. So that's kind of the baseline that they need model needs to cross here. And so I mean that could be one method to solving this. So we could this is potentially like other people can benchmark whether these agentic flow methods could work against our benchmark. So you can do various different types of solutions to try to solve this. It's not just post training and all of that stuff, but we're essentially with this astropropel effort, we want to see whether we can do this using post training, using SFT and then continued pre-training, and see if we can kind of do this kind of like large reasoning tasks, in-domain reasoning tasks. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thanks.
Other question? All right, if not, let's thank our speakers again. And let's see everyone in the fall. Thank you.